Hello, welcome to Inside Syria. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, after 3 years of violence in Syria, 1/3 of the population has been displaced, and activists say more than 150,000 people have been killed. Despite this, the government has said a presidential election will be held on June the 3rd. The announcement was made on Monday by the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammed Jihad al-Laham. He said the vote is a constitutional requirement and Syrians should be allowed to choose their leader.
I call on citizens of the Syrian Arab Republic inside and outside the country to practice their right to elect the President of Syria. And I call on those who want to nominate themselves to the post of Syria's President to present the request for nomination to the higher constitutional court.
Well, the announcement has been met by widespread criticism. The Syrian opposition called the elections a farce and said the international community should reject them. The United Nations and Western leaders have condemned the decision.
Both the Secretary General and the Joint Special Representative Lakhdar Brahimi have repeatedly warned that the holding of elections in the current circumstances amid the ongoing conflict and massive displacement will damage the political process and hamper the prospects for a political solution that the country so urgently needs.
He's making a mockery of his own pretensions to being a democratically elected leader. A presidential referendum, which is what this would be, is a parody of democracy and would have no credibility or legitimacy within Syria or outside of Syria.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. Joining us here in the studio, Saleh Mubarak, member of the Syrian National Council, and from London, Ammar Waqqaf, a Syrian activist, and from Oklahoma City, Joshua Landis, director at the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Joshua is also author of the website syriacomment.com. Thank you all for being with us, gentlemen. Ammar Waqqaf, now you've heard all the criticism there. How can an election be even allowed to take place in a country that's been ripped apart by war, tens of thousands of people killed, millions driven from their homes? What possible good will it serve, and what credibility can it bring?
Right. As a Syrian citizen and a stakeholder in this, I would, my position would stem out from answering really two main points, two questions. A, would these elections be good or bad for Syria? Are they needed? And B, how reflective will they be of the Syrian population's will, in a sense? On the first point, if these elections do not take place, then we would have a government in place that is sort of lacking mandate. We don't know when the Geneva talks are going to tell us that a political solution in Syria is going to take place imminently, and whether this solution is going to be, good or bad. I think it is better that the current government reinstates sort of its mandate. I realize, obviously, a lot of people do as well, that this is not the most perfect circumstance that presidential elections has taken place. But a new mandate wouldn't harm, in my opinion, the current government and the people who support the current government. On the second point, will this be reflective of the Syrian people's will? Obviously, because of all the displacement, all the refugees outside Syria, all the places like, for example, Britain, where I live, where I cannot vote because there is no Syrian embassy, then it won't. But if the Syrian government, who would be interested in this election, in a sense, from the point of view of telling the world or re-establishing their own position of a true representative of the Syrian state, if they can muster a sort of percentage of Syrians who are eligible to vote, and they participate in this, say 50–60% of Syrians do actually participate, then though not ideal, it would be sort of good enough to say, well, this is a good enough election and let's get on with it. Obviously, the circumstances are by no means ideal.
Saleh Mubarak, I know you see this completely differently, and there are obviously for you and your organization issues of credibility, and that's just one part of it, isn't it?
Well, it's just a mockery of you know, the situation. Syria has not had any presidential elections in over half a century. Since the Ba'ath Party took over in 1963, we did not have a single presidential elections. In fact, every time they go through this this ridiculous play of referendum, yes or no for the president, they waste a lot of time, a lot of money for a useless thing. Everyone knew in advance that it's going to be 99 point whatever %. And the what happened in the year 2000 when the former dictator Hafez al-Assad died was in fact an insult to every Syrian citizen when the parliament met briefly in about 15-20 minutes to change the constitution. It's not the law, it's the constitution, and lower the age to 30 from 40 to 34, as if among the million Syrians none of them is eligible. I mean, everything is ridiculous. We never had elections in the ideal situations. Now, in fact, you said 1/3 of the population. I would say about 1/2 of the Syrian population is displaced. Many of them do not even have an ID, do not have, they were bombed out of their homes and they ran away. They don't have any document. How could you, and then those who are still under the government-controlled territories, they will be intimidated as usual. I attended the 1978 referendum, and I remember how I was a college student. Two guys with the machine guns came in our classroom, ordered the professor and the students to go to the ballot room, and everyone had to mark the ballot under the watch of those two armed guys with two machine guns pointed at him. I mean, this is ridiculous. You know, we can't even imagine this is at this time.
Well, let's put some of that back then to Ammar Waqqaf. I mean, we talked about the sense in having this election in the middle of a civil war. Even in peacetime, there are issues of credibility with any elections in Syria, and the accusations, as you just heard, is that they make a mockery of democracy, of the whole process. Why should we think that things will be any different this time around?
Well, they simply won't, because of the, you know, all the clashes and all the rebellion that is taking place. There is no space whereby the government can say, well, let's implement a better process. Obviously, the previous process wasn't, you know, a Swiss clock sort of thing. However, in terms of adversity, and we need to take into consideration the Syrian people's aspirations here, in a sense. The main issue on everyone's mind who live in Syria mainly, and they have the bigger say in this, isn't really the democracy and who rules what and so on, but it's actually security. It's actually electricity. It's actually not being abducted outside your house or shop. And to restore that, they need a powerful government. They need to give a mandate to the government to achieve that. So that's what's there on their mind. Me living in London in the luxury of all the security and democracy of the English system and the British system, sorry. You know, I cannot dictate and tell them from here, you know, we need to look into a better democratic representation and a better political process. They dictate. It is them who are counting all the shots, not me. So on their mind, it's not really the best political system fabrication process, you know, to vote for at the moment. What is at stake is their lives and so on and so forth. So with whatever means they can secure that, and if they believe this candidate or that candidate is going to bring them that security, then it's their call, really, not me.
All right, I'm sure we're going to come back to some of that, but let's just give you a bit of context now. The government's announcement was made, as we said, during a civil war that has no end in sight. In 3 years of violence, activists at the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights say more than 150,000 people have been killed. 6.5 million people have had to leave their homes because of the violence. More than 2 million of them have gone to neighboring countries, and the United Nations estimates that right now more than 9 million people in Syria are in need of humanitarian aid. Let's take a look as well at how President Bashar al-Assad reached this point. He served as leader since 2000 when he took over from his father Hafez. He'd been in power for 30 years when he died. Bashar's brother Basil had originally been groomed as the future president, but he was killed in a car crash in 1994. Following his first term in power, Bashar al-Assad won an election in 2007. There were no candidates to oppose him, and he received over 97% of the vote. As the crisis in Syria deepened, Assad sought a referendum on an updated constitution to limit a serving president to 14 years. The constitution received 90% approval, but is seen by observers as essentially worthless. Let's bring in Joshua Landis on some of this now. I mean, Joshua, it says something, doesn't it, about the deep divisions in Syria right now, that an election makes complete sense to some, as you've just heard there, and is patently absurd and offensive to others.
Yes, I don't think anybody believes this is about democratic process. The country is in the middle of this brutal civil war, as you've said, and this is about might makes right. And who's going to win on the battlefield. And unfortunately for some, and fortunately for others, the consensus opinion, I think, in the international community today is that Assad is making progress. He's taking increasing neighborhoods. He's destroyed rebel groups. He's forced others to concede in Homs and so forth. He's taken more of Aleppo than he had before. He shut off the back door in Kalamoun to Lebanon resupply. And you know, many of the think tanks in Washington have come out with reports recently that say he looks like he's winning. Now, you know, Tony Blair just this week came out and said, well, Assad is less bad, less evil than the rebel alternative. And that, you know, I think he got heaped with abuse for this phrase, but I believe that in the security, you know, in U.S. security and European security, that is, in a sense, emerging as a consensus opinion. They do not see anybody on the rebel side to support who would be able to provide electricity, security, destroy al-Qaeda in Syria. The West is obsessed with al-Qaeda, and they believe that Syria could become a permanent platform for al-Qaeda in the future. They, unfortunately, you know, for the rebels, they begin to see Assad as a bulwark against al-Qaeda. The rebels say Assad is the magnet. As long as he's there, al-Qaeda people are going to come from around the world in order to fight him because he's unjust and he's killing his people. But that requires a leap of faith that if you destroy him, someone else will emerge to provide security for Syria. And we haven't seen that someone else. And the opposition has not been able to put anybody forward. The name that keeps on coming up is Jamal Ma'ruf and these other moderate warlords, soi-disant, quote unquote. And he, you know, as a construction worker who has almost no ideology, many people say he's a warlord who robs from people. So he hasn't caught on in the imagination of the West or even amongst the rebels or Syrians. And this is, in a sense, people are waiting for unity amongst the rebels. The West rejects Islamism. The rebel forces are largely Islamist. And that's where we are today.
I know Saleh Mubarak wants to respond to some of that. This is an issue, of course, that keeps coming up about these rebel groups and the fact that, you know, outside of Syria, in the West, there is no appetite for support from any of these rebel groups that are referred to as jihadists, as much as they would like to see the end of the Assad regime. Who wants to back some of these groups?
Well, you know, there are 2 points here. One, the first point, we were talking about the elections. And I want to come back to a point that Mr. Waqqaf just said, that this election will give sort of like legitimacy. So in a way, he admits that the current situation has been, you know, illegitimate. And also that somebody who's strong, who can provide food, electricity, and so on, what prevents the, I mean, everyone knows that this so-called election will, you know, make it another 7 years for Assad. If he could provide that, what prevents him from providing that security and food and electricity in the past few years? The fact is he cannot. But what you know, Joshua is saying, I kind of agree and disagree at the same time, because from the beginning, when there was no radicalism in this conflict, the West was reluctant in helping the mainstream opposition. And that reluctance is actually what radicalized the revolution. And that's a fact that nobody, even the West does not deny that. Now, how would we deal? And I still maintain the fact that the bulk of the opposition is mainstream, and the radical elements are minorities, but unfortunately the spotlight is being on them. Now, can we, after the fall of Assad, take Syria to a safe ground where we can, unite
you
together?
You being the SNC, your organization.
The SNC and the coalition, of course. I think we can. It's going to take some effort and time, yes. And let's, bring an example. The former Yugoslavian Republic of Bosnia. During that war, many radical groups went in. And after the end of the war, the former president, Ali Izzat Begovic, he very wisely managed to sail in the safe direction, expel the many of those radical, elements out, and it's stable now. I don't think, the majority of the Syrian people are very mainstream. I've talked to them, but people in the West have to understand that the Syrian people are, in general, holding on to their religion. They're Muslims. They're observing Muslims, and particularly in those times, even I've seen people who never prayed in their life and so on. When they see those hardships, they see death in front of their eyes, they come back to God. It doesn't mean that they're ridiculous. They're radical. I'm sorry. And we saw in one of the interviews with Senator John McCain on Fox News, when the commentator was saying, I have a problem in supporting those people, just because he was saying Allahu Akbar when he shot down a fighter jet. And very wisely, Senator McCain responded to him, why do you have a problem with somebody saying praise God? This is natural. I would say praise God or Allahu Akbar every time I see something I admire. It doesn't mean that I'm radical or I'm a fanatic or anything. I think it's the West who's trying to escape the responsibility of not being a positive part of this, that helped to radicalize the situation.
All right, let's put some of that to Ammar Waqqaf there, and the point that Saleh made a little bit earlier about the fact that this started as peaceful protests against the Assad regime, and it's that regime's brutal response to those protests that radicalized radicalized the opposition and turned it into a full-fledged civil war.
I don't agree. I think what happened in Syria, the way the political system, you want to call it the regime, I would call it the government, dealt with the demonstrations in the very beginning isn't really any different from what happened in Egypt and what happened in Tunisia and what happened in Yemen. It is only in Syria and Libya, the only two anti-West countries, that these demonstrations turned into violent processes that started a civil war that cannot be extinguished. But I want to go back to what your guest in the studio, Mr. Mubarak, said. I never said that the government or the elections lack any legitimacy. There are two considerations. I'll go back into them. Is this good or bad for Syria, this election? I believe it is good, because to have a government in place, which is what's going to happen if these elections don't happen or don't take place, President Assad will remain in power. For him to remain in power with a new mandate is much better for Syria, in my opinion, than for him to remain in power without a clear mandate from the population. Will these elections be representative? I think that the government can say that they have more than 50 or 60% of the Syrian population eligible and capable of voting. And the number you mentioned earlier, Joshua, that there are like 6 million
I just want to turn back to Joshua on this. Do we focus too much on these jihadist groups and the point that was made earlier that there is so much of the Syrian public right now that simply wants to be rid of Assad and are not don't share the same worldview as these jihadist groups? What do you say to that?
Well, probably objectively one does. The trouble is the West is terrified by 9/11. Britain is terrified by subway bombings and other things. Spain, train bombings. Al-Qaeda and radical jihadists have had an impact on the West. And that's what the West cares about. That's what politicians in the West are dealing with. Saudi Arabia has also had bombings and so forth. And so has Jordan. bombings from Zarqawi's group. So they are paralyzed with fear by these jihadist groups. And that has to be contended with. And the trouble is that even the mainline Islamic groups in Syria, Zahran al-Lush, the Islamic Army, the Islamic Front, have come out and stated on your channel, on Al Jazeera, that they are not for democracy. They believe God should rule, and this is a template for Iran, and or some government that reflects Iran. And that the West says, I don't want Iran. They've been fighting Iran for 40 years. They find it inimical. They don't like it, and so they're paralyzed. They don't want. And they don't want Somalia, and that's the biggest fear. I think if they could have Iran, they might even be reassured. It's the notion that these militia groups that have been fighting each other and the government for the last 3 years have shown no ability to unify and to agree on what Syria should be, that they don't know what to do. And rather than spend money on it, and the West is extremely adverse to spending money today, they are throwing up their hands and they're taking a counter-terrorist approach to Syria. They're saying, we know how to do counter-terrorism. We're listening to all of their cell phone calls. If any group starts planning an attack on Washington or London, we're going to kill them. Otherwise, we're going to do nothing. And that, unfortunately, for the Syrians, is the approach that the West is taking today.
Saleh Mubarak, I know you want to respond to some of that first. Go ahead.
Very quickly, 2 points. And I see a very irony in what Mr. Landis said, with all due respect, as if it's 200,000 Syrians are, and more are dying just because of our fear in the West. We don't want something to happen, so let half of the Syrian people perish. It's a very, selfish way of looking at it. I know they're obsessed with that and so on, but rather than helping the mainstream, they're leaving the two sides fight to death. The other point is he's comparing to Iran. No. The Muslim Sunni is completely, we don't have theology. We don't have the hierarchy that he's talking about. We don't have somebody who said, I represent God. In fact, I've talked, with all confidence, I can say I've talked to people in the inside a lot more, thousands than the other guests have. And we have an agreement that there will be, it's not unanimous, but the majority says we want democracy. Now, would that democracy lead to somebody who has an Islamic reference go to the, to rule the country? That's possible, but it's also possible for somebody who is secular. Let's not remember that Syria itself elected a Christian prime minister about 60 years ago or 70 years ago after the independence. So the Syrian people are not fanatic in any way, and those people who are fanatic, they're not going to dictate the future of Syria.
Okay, I want to bring up a criticism as well that's been made of your organization, and it comes back to the issue of credibility that we were talking about. We talked earlier about the credibility of this election in Syria. There are issues of credibility with the SNC. Many people say that they are divided too much of the time, that they lack cohesion, and basically that the organization is sort of a talking shop that doesn't have enough influence inside Syria. What do you say to that?
Well, that's true, but let's remember that the coalition now is in the lead, not the SNC, but both of them exist, and that's true. This is a revolution. This is not led by one person or one group or one party. It's a revolution, and the revolution is multicolor, of course, of all kinds of types and shades. So you have a lot of people who have different ideas. But what's common among all of them is one thing: we want to get rid of the Assad regime and establish a country that has democracy and freedom and equality under the law.
All right, on that note, we've got to leave it. Thank you to all three of our guests: Saleh Mubarak here in the studio, and Ammar Waqqaf in London, Joshua Landis in Oklahoma. Thanks very much for your time. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria on air and online. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. From me and all the team, goodbye for now.